If you watch YouTube and you're interested in psychic phenomena, you may have seen this footage from the 1960s of a Russian woman, Nina Kulagina, apparently moving objects across the surface of a table by mind force, psychokinesis or telekinesis as it's also known. Crazy stuff. But then here's the late James Randi, a conjurer, doing the exact same thing by tricks. So does that mean that Kulagina's act was fake and the people who filmed it were in on it or just didn't realize? If that's the case, it would mean that people who watch these clips may be being fooled into thinking that psychokinesis is a real thing, when actually it isn't. Well, possibly, but not necessarily. If you want to know the truth about things like this, you can't just go with appearances on either side. You have to dig deeper, and that's what I want to do in this video, to learn more about the background and the circumstances, look at other similar cases, and try to find out what's really behind claims of this kind. Hello, my name's Robert, and on this channel I talk about anomalous experiences that we call psychic or paranormal, and the controversy that surrounds them. If, like me, you were around in the 1960s, you may vaguely recall hearing about Kulagina in the media. It got quite a bit of attention. I remember being mildly curious. Then just a few years later, I read somewhere that she'd been outed as a trickster, and I thought, okay, that sounds right. There's obviously no such thing as psychokinesis, so of course she's fake. But then in midlife, for various reasons, I started to take these things more seriously, and I discovered all sorts of things I'd never heard about before. Eventually, I got involved in helping to create an encyclopedia about them. And when it came to creating an entry about Ninel Kulagina, we naturally wanted to try to get a reliable view, and here's what we found. First, a bit about her background. She was a citizen of St. Petersburg, or Leningrad as it then was, and was caught up in the horrific siege by the German Nazis in World War II. Already at 14, she was a radio operator in a tank regiment, and at 17, she was seriously injured. She recovered, and when the war was over, married and raised 3 children. Around this time, Soviet scientists had been doing paranormal research, and there had been press reports about eyeless sight, people claiming to perceive colors or symbols without using their eyes. She said she'd had this experience herself, and she began taking part in scientific experiments. Then she apparently acquired a new skill, moving small objects without touching them, and over the next 2 decades took part in more than 100 experimental sessions, some in laboratory settings. People saw her moving objects such as matchsticks, cigarettes, compasses, small containers, and even heavier objects up to several hundred grams, sometimes when they were enclosed under a glass case. The movements were typically slow and hesitant, seemingly needing intense concentration and repeated effort. In these clips, we see objects moving towards her, which was apparently mainly the case to begin with, but in later years they were said also to move away from her. Sometimes more than one object moved at once. She could make a compass needle spin, or reverse a swinging pendulum, or make it stop completely. She could make objects floating in water move, prevent scales from tipping. Or she could make another person feel intense heat just by placing a hand on their skin. She was also said in science laboratories to have influenced biological systems, such as stopping a frog's heart and briefly reviving a near-dead fish. But most of the attention was on her ability to make small objects move across a table. And as far as I know, and tell me if I'm wrong in the comments, if it isn't actually psychokinesis, there are only 2 ways to do this. One is to surreptitiously attach very thin threads to the object and loop the other ends around your feet, which you can then move around under the table. The other is to hide strong magnets under your clothes and move your body to exert a force on the objects. And skeptics accused her of doing both. In Wikipedia, which takes a reliably dim view of this sort of thing, she's said to have been caught cheating. Okay, I'll come back to that, but first I want to look at a very similar case that took place in Poland half a century earlier. It concerns a young woman in Warsaw named Stanislawa Tomczyk. She just turned 20 when she suffered some sort of trauma after getting caught up in a street protest and being arrested. Following this episode, it was said, unusual physical disturbances began occurring around her home, knocking sounds that seemed to come from the furniture with no obvious cause, tables and chairs moving around. Objects were seen to spontaneously fall off shelves or move themselves across the room. This got the attention of Julian Okorowicz, a psychologist and hypnotherapist, and he did experiments with her at his home, taking photos. He'd get her into a light hypnotic trance. Then she simply sat at a table and passed her hands over small objects that he placed there: billiard balls, a compass, a pencil, a handbell, and a lighted cigarette, that sort of thing, making them move. Some of the images show her apparently having raised an object off the table and keeping it suspended in mid-air. A striking feature of these experiments was the appearance of what looked like fine threads extending between Stanislava's hands and the objects, exactly what you'd expect to see if it was bogus. But she was thoroughly searched before sessions and made to wash her hands precisely to ensure she wasn't concealing anything. And Okorowicz didn't say these were physical threads that she was using fraudulently. They seemed to him to be made of a substance produced by herself, like a spider's web. It was as if her unconscious mind was literally manufacturing something that would project a bodily force. He said that while he was examining them, he'd felt the threads on his skin and face like brushing up against cobwebs, but they were purely temporary. The moment Stanislava separated her hands, they abruptly vanished. Stanislava herself described sensations of tingling heat, fatigue, and what she said felt like a current flowing from her fingers. Other scientists were intrigued and came to see for themselves. A medical committee in Warsaw formally certified the phenomena as genuine, at least in the sense that its members couldn't find any normal explanation. Others came from abroad. Charles Richet, a French Nobel Prize-winning physiologist, said he'd seen her levitating objects just as Okorowicz had described, and like Okorowicz was 100% certain that there was no kind of trickery. More investigations were carried out in Germany in 1914 by Albert von Schrenck-Notzing, a psychiatrist and veteran of this sort of research. He reported seeing objects move repeatedly in front of Stanislava without her touching them, her arms bare and her hands closely watched. Balls rolled, scales registered pressure. Objects were flung from containers without contact. Another was Theodor Flournoy, a Swiss psychologist. He was present at 9 sittings and was convinced by them. Everard Fielding, a British investigator, observed successful sittings in Warsaw and Munich, and he brought her to London to be tested by his colleagues, although by this time the effects were apparently less visible, possibly because Stanislava was unwell. Now there's just one more case I want to look at. This concerns Felicia Parise, an American woman who'd been working with parapsychologists in the early 1970s and happened to be present when they were showing a film recording of Ninel Kulagina. Parise was inspired and decided to see whether she herself could move objects by mental effort alone. She said she didn't get far to start with. Relaxation and meditation didn't seem to help. What did finally trigger success, she said, was the intense emotion she was feeling because her grandmother was terminally ill. One day, when she was handling a small plastic pill bottle, she saw it move away from her without physical contact, and after weeks of practice, she could make it happen almost at will. Now she told Charles Honiton, one of the parapsychologists she'd been working with. He went to visit and reported seeing her move a pill bottle several inches across the kitchen counter in a stop-start curved path, including a brief reversal of direction. He thoroughly examined the bottle and surroundings and wasn't able to reproduce the movement by any normal means. Over the following months, Parise demonstrated similar effects repeatedly under observation. She also learned to deflect the needle of a compass, even when her hands were restrained or examined for concealed magnets. She was even visited by an amateur magician who filmed her moving objects that had been placed beneath a heavy glass bell jar, including corks, aluminium foil, water-filled containers, and a compass whose needle rotated fully. He knew what tricks to look out for, but he said he didn't see any. Producing these effects was physically demanding, as the other 2 women also found. Parise's heart rate, breathing, and blood pressure all rose sharply. She experienced trembling, perspiration, fatigue, and even brief difficulty speaking afterwards. Eventually she had to stop because it was so exhausting, especially as she had to keep giving demonstrations to convince skeptics. Here, too, critics claimed that she used invisible threads, but they didn't have any direct evidence. Okay, so here we have 3 cases of women performing what appear to be feats of psychokinesis, something that ought not to be possible, that defies fundamental laws of nature as science understands them. So now here's the fun question. Was what they were doing really psychokinesis? Or were they just faking, as you might well think, doing close-up magic that fooled just about everyone who saw it? In cases like this, there's a sort of seesaw effect where you're at first astounded by something you see. Then, when you see someone else doing the exact same thing by tricks, you feel a bit disgusted with the person who deceived you, as you now believe, and even a bit with yourself for letting yourself be fooled. Of course, we need to be extremely cautious about accepting any paranormal claim, especially something as dramatic as this. But we might also need to be careful not to leap the other way, at least until we know the whole story. And the reason these cases interest me is that they're relatively straightforward, in that people could see what was happening, which isn't often the case. Psychokinesis was a big topic of investigation in the late 19th and 20th centuries. This was the heyday of the spiritualist mediums, seances held in darkened rooms, in which all kinds of weird things happened. Levitations of tables and chairs, ghostly presences and voices, all supposed to be generated by spirits of dead people. Some investigators became convinced it was real, others found it hard to be sure, because the conditions were so chaotic, and critics found it flat out ridiculous. Even within the parapsychological community, to this day, there's no real consensus about it. But to me, in these cases, the conditions seem much less ambiguous. The rooms weren't dark. People could see what was going on. They could see exactly what the person was doing and check to see whether any threads actually were being used. I mean, they were standing right next to the table, watching from a distance of just 1 or 2 feet. So you'd think they'd notice if that was happening. At any time, they could simply reach out with their own hands and swipe a path across the table to check. You hear skeptics say it never occurred to them to do that. But that's not really believable, and there's no evidence to support it. After all, if you or I were doing this sort of experiment, isn't that exactly what we would do? You don't need to be an expert conjurer to figure that out. With Kulagina, one debunking conjurer even alleged that the objects were being manipulated by threads not by her, but by her husband in another room. And surely if that was the case, it would be blindingly obvious. With Stanislawa, in particular, there are frequent references to her being made to wash her hands beforehand, wear short sleeves, constant checks being made. It's true that in her case, threads were observed, and as you'd expect, skeptics treat this as a damning exposure. But to repeat, the scientists made clear that these weren't actual cotton or nylon threads. They were like spider webs that came into existence and then disappeared. And it would have been much harder for Kulagina to achieve the effect by trickery when she made objects move away from her, which was said sometimes to happen. It's the same with the idea of concealed magnets, which wouldn't work with non-metal objects like cigarettes or glass ornaments. But then what about the faking claims? Wikipedia's article on Kulagina states that she was caught cheating on more than one occasion, according to the authors of several books and publications. Here are the references. Joel Levy in his Guide to the Unexplained. Tricks were employed by Russian housewife and psychic Ninel Kulagina, who was caught using invisible thread to lift tennis balls and hidden magnets to move salt shakers. Now, I think you'll agree the meaning of caught cheating leaves no room for doubt. She was caught red-handed, in the act. Here's historian Mike Dash, who says, the Russian psychic Ninel Kulagina was eventually caught by Soviet parapsychologists using concealed magnets and invisible thread to effect her tricks. Again, caught, very specific. Here are 2 authors, Kravitz and Hillebrand, quoting a third writer, Martin Gardner. Ninel has been caught cheating more than once by Soviet establishment scientists. That makes it even more specific, as it implies there must be some documented source, a written report which gives details of how this deception was uncovered, when and in what circumstances. But as far as I've been able to determine, no such source exists. There is no written report by Soviet scientists or Western scientists or anybody, which describes an incident during the course of an experiment with Kulagina in which either threads were found to be attached to objects being manipulated or magnets concealed in her clothing. So where does this claim come from that she was caught red-handed? What's the source? The nearest I've been able to discover is that it was made in an article in the Soviet newspaper Pravda, which quoted a skeptical article in a Leningrad newspaper which merely alleged that Kulagina had been cheating. And this was picked up in the Western media and treated as established fact. This is actually rather normal in cases of this kind, as anybody who's been involved in these sorts of investigations knows only too well. When the media starts to get hold of it, all sorts of claims about fraud and cheating get made that have no real substance. It's just gossip, hearsay. The only other thing is a statement in a report by Russian scientists that a strong magnetic field was observed around Kulagina, from which apparently some people ran off with the idea that she was literally hiding magnets in her underwear. But that's not at all what the authors of the report said, and they didn't seem to attach much significance to the presence of a magnetic field, since many of the objects she'd been successfully moving were made of non-magnetic materials like glass and aluminium, which would mean she was using threads, which weren't observed. I'm making a point about all this because I want to show how misleading so much public information on these things actually is when suspicions, accusations, allegations are transformed into actual fact. Which is why I think it's important to be at least as skeptical about the critical commentary as about the claims themselves. Of course, no one likes to be thought credulous or gullible, so it's easy and cost-free to align with skeptic ideas. But if you're serious about getting to the bottom of it, at the very least you need to go beyond the superficial allegations and get to grips with the scientific reports, the findings of people who observed these women in action at very close quarters. You'd then see how detailed and exhaustive the investigations were and how little support they give to the skeptic claims. If you want to read more, then do check out the entries for all three of them in the Sciencyclopedia, which will give you the sources if you want to do your own research. I'll leave the links in the description below, and thanks for watching.